You're what, 40? Expired goods. She said it like she was examining produce at a market, her voice carrying across the marble ballroom, where crystal chandeliers threw fractured light onto 300 company employees, pretending not to listen. Her name was Isolde, 29, draped in emeralds that caught every eye in the room, and she was smiling the way people smile when they know nobody will stop them. I stood there in my 6-year-old gown, the one I'd steamed that morning to hide the wear along the seams, holding a glass of water because champagne felt wasteful when my salary barely covered my mother's medical bills. The executives from the international division were watching now, their conversations dying mid-sentence, and Isolde leaned closer, her perfume expensive enough to announce itself. No wonder you're here alone at a company gala. Who'd want someone so far past their prime? She turned to her friends, those 3 polished men from the Paris office who laughed on cue, and I felt something crack inside my chest. Not from pain, but from the sudden clarity that comes when you realize someone has made a terrible miscalculation. I smiled, adjusted my ring. The platinum band with the intricate family crest caught the light, throwing tiny reflections across her face, and I watched her father appear beside me, my husband of 3 years, the man whose company name sat on every contract in this building, his hand warm on my lower back. Before we go any further, thank you for being here and listening to this. If this story is hitting you somewhere deep, do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment about your thoughts, and subscribe because what happens next is going to shake everything you think you know about power and patience. Now, let me tell you who I really am. My name is Estelle, 43 now, though at that gala I was freshly 40, which apparently qualified me for disposal in Isolde's world. I grew up in a small manufacturing town, where my father worked the assembly line for 30 years until automation took his job and his will to wake up in the morning. I learned early that work was survival, not passion, and I built my life around being useful, being present, being the person who showed up when everyone else had gone home. I moved to the city at 22 with a business degree from a state university and a resume that nobody wanted to read twice. For 18 years, I worked in the strategy division of the same company, analyzing market trends, preparing reports that executives presented as their own ideas, arriving before sunrise because the early train was cheaper, and staying late because going home to my empty apartment felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to face. I wasn't lonely, exactly. I was efficient. I had my mother in a care facility across town, her mind slipping further each month, and every dollar I earned went to keeping her somewhere clean and safe, where the nurses knew her name. Romance felt like something from another person's life, something for women who had time to maintain their highlights and wear perfume that cost more than groceries. Then 3 years before that gala, the company hosted a charity auction to raise money for youth education programs. I wasn't supposed to attend. I was supposed to manage the guest list from a back room, checking names against the database, making sure every donor felt important. But the event coordinator got food poisoning 2 hours before doors opened, and someone shoved a headset in my ear and told me to handle it. I wore my only professional outfit, the navy suit I saved for presentations, and I moved through that ballroom making sure everything flowed, that the auction paddles reached the right hands, that the catering staff knew when to refresh the appetizers. That's when I met Callum. He was standing alone near the silent auction tables, studying a collection of first edition novels, like they held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. 73 years old, silver hair that refused to cooperate, wearing a suit that fit like it had been made for him because it had. I didn't know who he was. I just saw someone who looked lost, and I'd spent my whole life helping people find their way. The poetry collection on the end table is underpriced, I told him, adjusting my headset. Nobody's bidding because they don't recognize the author, but she won 3 international awards last year. Someone's gonna steal that for nothing. He looked at me then, really looked, the way most people don't bother. You read poetry? He asked. I read everything, I said. It's free, and it takes you places you can't afford to go. We talked for 20 minutes while I worked, about books and loss, and how grief changes the way you see people. His wife had died 2 years earlier after 47 years of marriage, and he said the hardest part wasn't the absence, but the presence of all the things that reminded him she was gone. I told him about my father, how losing his job had killed him slower than any disease could have, How watching someone disappear while they're still breathing teaches you that survival isn't the same as living. He asked for my number. I gave it to him because he seemed kind, and kindness was rare enough to deserve a response. We met for breakfast 3 days later at a diner near my apartment where the eggs were cheap and the coffee was terrible. He ordered the same thing I did, laughed at my jokes about the strategy division's obsession with color-coded charts, told me about his daughter who ran the European operations and how proud he was, even though something in his voice suggested the pride was complicated. We met again, and again. He never mentioned being chairman. I never mentioned working 70 floors below his executive suite. We were just two people who'd learned that time was the most valuable thing you could give someone, and we gave it freely. 3 months later, we got married at the courthouse downtown on a Thursday afternoon. No announcement, no celebration, just us and two witnesses pulled from the hallway. Callum asked me not to tell anyone at the company, and I understood without needing explanation. My daughter has expectations, he said that evening in his apartment, which I'd just learned about. This sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city I'd only ever seen from ground level. She believes the company will be hers. She's built her entire identity around that assumption, made promises to people based on that future. I asked him why that mattered if she was capable. He was quiet for a long time. Capability and character aren't the same thing, he finally said. She's brilliant, ruthless, but she sees people as functions, not humans. And I don't know if that's something she learned or something she is. Isolde ran the European division from Paris. 32, educated at the best, international schools, fluent in 5 languages, with a track record of aggressive expansion that made the board members nod approvingly during quarterly reviews. I'd seen her name on reports, watched her presentations via video link, studied the way she restructured entire departments to hit her targets. She was good at what she did, but good and right were having a quiet war in those reports, if you knew how to read between the data. High turnover, employee complaints that were settled with money and silence, client contracts won through relationships that felt less like partnerships and more like hostage negotiations, revenue growth that looked impressive until you calculated what it cost in human terms. My life became 2 separate existences. At work, I remained Estelle from strategy, the woman who arrived at dawn and left after dark, whose ideas appeared in executive presentations without attribution, who was so forgettable that people sometimes asked my name twice in the same meeting. At home, I was Callum's wife, learning what it meant to build something across generations, to watch your legacy become a living thing that could thrive or devour depending on who took control. Callum talked about the company the way other people talked about children. He'd built it from 6 employees in a warehouse to 11,000 people across 14 countries. Every decision he made carried the weight of all those lives, all those families, depending on stability in an unstable world. I wanted to leave it to Isolde. He told me one evening, his voice heavy with something that felt like mourning. I wanted her to care about it the way I do, but she cares about winning, and winning isn't the same as sustaining. I started paying closer attention to the European numbers, not because Callum asked, but because I'd spent 18 years learning how to read what reports didn't say. Isolde's division showed consistent growth, quarter after quarter, the kind of trajectory that made investors excited. But underneath that growth was something uglier. She'd restructured the Paris office 3 times in 2 years, cutting staff and redistributing work until the remaining employees were drowning. She'd entered new markets by underbidding established competitors, then raising prices once she'd driven them out. She'd fired a 56-year-old department head who'd been with the company for 23 years because his numbers were stagnant, replacing him with someone half his age and half his salary. Every move made sense on a spreadsheet. Every move destroyed something that couldn't be quantified. Isolde returned from Paris for the annual company Gala, the event where executives networked and employees pretended they were part of something bigger than their job descriptions. She'd been back for 3 days, meeting with board members, having private dinners with the investment team, building alliances for the transition she believed was inevitable. I'd seen her once in the hallway outside Callum's office, her voice carrying through the heavy door. "Father, the company needs younger leadership, someone who understands how to move fast in changing markets. You've built something incredible, but it's time to let it evolve." She said it like evolution was something she'd invented, like progress meant erasing everything that came before. The gala was mandatory for strategy division employees. We were expected to attend, to represent the company, to make small talk with clients and partners while pretending we weren't counting the hours until we could leave. I wore my old gown, the black one with the simple neckline that I'd bought for my cousin's wedding 6 years earlier, and I took the train because parking downtown was expensive. Callum had wanted to arrive together, but I'd insisted on keeping our separation. 1 more month, he'd said. Then we tell everyone. I just need to handle some board transitions first. I didn't argue. I understood that his world had rules mine didn't, that wealth and power came with complications that my paycheck never required me to navigate. The ballroom was excessive in the way expensive events always are. Too much of everything. I stayed near the fountain where sparkling water cascaded over glass sculptures, holding my water glass, watching Isolde work the room. She moved like she owned it, stopping at each cluster of executives, her laugh bright and sharp, her promises flowing freely. When I take over, we're going global in ways Father never imagined. She told a group from the investment team, her voice loud enough to carry. We'll move into emerging markets, establish dominance before competitors know we're there. The old guard thinks stability matters more than growth, but that's why they're the old guard. The men around her nodded, hungry for the aggression she was selling. She noticed me eventually. I wasn't hiding, but I wasn't inserting myself into conversations, either. I was just there, fulfilling my mandatory attendance, thinking about whether the last train home was at 11 or midnight. She broke away from her group and walked toward me, her heels clicking against marble, her emerald necklace catching every light source in the room. 3 executives followed her, those Paris office men I recognized from video conferences, their suits tailored and their smiles practiced. You work in strategy, right? Isolde said, though she didn't wait for confirmation. I remember seeing your name on some reports. Funny seeing someone your age still grinding away at the junior level. Most women have the sense to step aside by now, make room for people with actual potential. Her friends laughed. That automatic response of people who've learned that agreeing with power is easier than questioning it. I didn't respond immediately. I was calculating something, measuring the distance between who she thought I was and who I actually was, wondering if revealing the truth would feel like victory or just sadness for what Callum was about to lose. Then she leaned in closer, her perfume overwhelming, her voice dropping to something that was supposed to sound confidential, but was loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. You're what, 40? Expired goods. No wonder you're here alone, at a company gala. Who'd want someone so far past their prime? That's when I adjusted my ring. The platinum band with Callum's family crest. The design that had been in his family for 4 generations. Intricate and unmistakable. The light caught it, threw tiny reflections across Isolde's face, and I watched her expression shift from confidence to confusion. Callum appeared beside me then, his timing perfect because he'd been watching from across the room, waiting to see if I needed him. Darling, he said, his hand settling on my lower back, his lips brushing my cheek. I've been looking everywhere. The ballroom didn't go silent. That's not how real life and works. But the conversations around us fractured, people turning to watch without being obvious about it. Their glasses paused halfway to their mouths. Isolde stared at the ring, then at her father, then back at me, her brain trying to process information that didn't fit her understanding of how the world was supposed to work. Father, this is, she started, but Callum interrupted her, his voice gentle but absolutely clear. My wife, of 3 years. The color drained from Isolde's face in stages. First the certainty, then the composure, finally the superiority that had armored her entire life. She opened her mouth twice before words came out. 3 years? You've been married for 3 years? And nobody knew? Her voice climbed higher with each syllable, heads turning now. No pretense of privacy. Callum kept his hand on my back, steady and warm. We kept it private. That was my choice, not Estelle's. I thought it would give you time to prove yourself, without the pressure of competition. Isolde's laugh came out sharp and wounded. Competition? With her? She's nobody. She's a junior analyst who probably saw an opportunity and took it. I felt Callum's hand tighten slightly, a warning or a comfort. I couldn't tell. but I spoke before he could. I didn't know who he was when we met. I was managing a guest list. He was alone at an auction. We talked about books. The simplicity of it seemed to enrage her more than any elaborate defense would have. Books, she repeated, like the word tasted rotten. My father married someone who makes poverty wages because they talked about books. One of the Paris executives cleared his throat, suddenly fascinated by his champagne glass. The others found reasons to drift away, their loyalty to Isolde apparently conditional on her maintaining the upper hand. She watched them go, something crumbling behind her expression, then turned back to Callum. Does the board know? He nodded. They've known for 2 years, I informed. Then once it became clear this wasn't temporary. Isolde's hands were shaking now, her emerald necklace catching the light with each breath. This is why you've been stalling on the succession plan. This is why every board meeting ends with more delays, more evaluations, more requirements. Callum's voice stayed level, but I heard the sadness underneath. The succession plan has nothing to do with my marriage. It has everything to do with whether you're ready to lead 11,000 people towards something sustainable. She looked at me then, really looked, and I saw her doing calculations, trying to figure out what I wanted, what threat I posed. What's your play here? You think marrying him gives you claim to the company? You think you can push me out? I met her gaze. I don't think about you at all. I think about my job. I think about my mother. I think about my husband. You don't factor into any of that. The honesty of it seemed to knock something loose in her. She stepped back, her heel catching on the marble, and Callum reached out instinctively to steady her. She jerked away from his hand like it burned. Don't touch me. Don't pretend you care when you've been lying to me for 3 years. She looked around the ballroom, at all the employees and executives now openly watching, their phones probably already broadcasting this across company message boards. Everyone's going to know about this by morning. Everyone's going to see that you chose some random middle-aged nobody over your own daughter. Then she walked away, her composure reconstructed enough to keep her spine straight, her exit swift enough to suggest retreat without admitting defeat. Callum exhaled slowly beside me. That went better than I expected, he said, and I couldn't tell if he was serious. We left the gala 20 minutes later, ignoring the stares and the whispered conversations. In the car, Callum was quiet for a long time, watching the city lights blur past the window. She's going to fight this, he finally said. She's going to see you as the enemy now, as the reason she's not getting what she believes she's owed. I thought about that, about becoming the target of someone who'd spent her whole life learning how to win. What do you want me to do? I asked. He turned to look at me, his face tired in the dashboard light. I want you to be yourself. I want you to keep doing what you've always done, and I want you to understand that what comes next won't be easy. He was right. By Monday morning, the entire company knew. I walked into the strategy division at dawn like always, and the usual quiet hum of early workers had shifted into something else. People looked up when I entered. People who'd never noticed me before suddenly found reasons to walk past my workspace. My supervisor called me into his office before lunch, his discomfort obvious in the way he wouldn't quite meet my gaze. There's been some concern, he said carefully, about potential conflicts of interest, about whether your position here is appropriate given your relationship to the chairman. I felt something icy settle in my chest. I've been in this position for 18 years. I married Callum 3 years ago. My work hasn't changed. He nodded too quickly. Of course. But perception matters. The board has suggested that perhaps you might want to consider a transfer to a different division, somewhere without direct reporting lines to executive leadership. I understood what he wasn't saying. They wanted me gone, or at least moved somewhere I couldn't be accused of having influence. And if I don't transfer? I asked. His pause told me everything. Then we'd have to reevaluate your role here. I went home that evening and told Callum. He was furious in that quiet way that powerful people get, where the anger becomes colder instead of hotter. They have no grounds. Your performance reviews are spotless. You've never asked for special treatment. I sat across from him in his apartment that still didn't quite feel like mine, even after 3 years. They're scared of what Isolde will do if they don't show loyalty. She's the heir apparent. I'm just the inconvenient wife. Callum picked up his phone, started to dial, then stopped. If I intervene, it proves them right. It proves you only have value because of me. The truth of that sat heavy between us. So, What do I do? I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. You decide what you want, not what I want, not what they expect, what you actually want. I thought about that question for 3 days. What did I want? I'd spent 40 years being useful, being present, being the person who showed up and did the work without expecting recognition. I'd built a life around being invisible, around survival, rather than ambition. But something had shifted at that gala. When Isolde called me expired goods, when she dismissed my existence like I was something past my usefulness date, I realized I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of watching other people take credit for my ideas. I was tired of accepting that 40 meant finished, that not being young or beautiful or connected meant not mattering. So I made a choice that probably looked insane to everyone watching. I didn't transfer. I didn't quit. I enrolled in the company's executive leadership program. The program was intensive, designed for high-potential employees being groomed for senior management. 2 years of coursework, rotational assignments, mentorship from executive leadership. Most participants were in their late 20s or early 30s, ambitious and hungry, with trajectories already pointing upward. I was 42, still in the same position I'd held for nearly 2 decades, with no executive experience and a resume that screamed, support staff. My application went through 3 rounds of review before it was accepted, and I knew Callum had nothing to do with the approval because he'd promised not to interfere and he kept his promises. I got in because my performance metrics were undeniable, because 18 years of doing excellent invisible work had left a paper trail that even bias couldn't erase. Isolde heard about it within days. She was back in Paris by then, running her division from a distance, but the company communication networks carried information across oceans faster than official channels ever could. She called Callum on a Friday evening, her voice loud enough through the speakerphone that I could hear every word from across the room. She's enrolled in the leadership program? Your wife is trying to position herself for executive management? Callum stayed calm. Estelle makes her own career decisions. This has nothing to do with me. Isolde's laugh was brittle. Everything she does has to do with you. She's nobody without your name. And now she's trying to take what's mine. Callum's voice hardened then. The company isn't yours. It's never been yours. It's something you have the opportunity to earn, same as anyone else. The line went dead. Isolde had hung up, unable to hear what she didn't want to believe. The leadership program started in September. I showed up that first day to a room full of people who looked at me like I was someone's mother who'd wandered into the wrong building. The program director did a double take when I introduced myself, checking his roster like my name might have been a clerical error. Estelle? From strategy division? He said it the way you'd confirm someone's identity before telling them they'd made a mistake. That's me, I said, taking a chair in the second row, my notebook already open. The coursework was brutal. Financial modeling, strategic planning, organizational psychology, international market analysis. We had assignments due weekly, case studies that required 40-hour deep dives, presentations to actual executives who asked questions designed to expose weaknesses. I studied the way I'd studied in college, when every grade mattered, because scholarships were the only thing standing between me and dropping out. I stayed up until 2 in the morning, reading market reports. I practiced presentations alone in my apartment until the words felt natural. I asked questions in class, even when I knew they might sound basic, because learning mattered more than looking competent. The younger participants were brilliant and brutal in the way young, ambitious people often are. They formed study groups that didn't include me. They networked at happy hours I wasn't invited to. They made jokes about the program letting in diversity candidates that weren't explicitly about age but didn't have to be. I didn't fight for inclusion. I just kept working, kept learning, kept showing up prepared. By the 3rd month, something shifted. I answered a question in class about supply network vulnerabilities that none of the younger participants had considered, drawing on 18 years of watching how information actually flowed through the organization. The instructor paused, made a note, asked me to elaborate. I did. After class, 2 of the younger participants approached me. That thing you said about informal communication channels, one of them said. Could you explain that more? We're working on a case study about organizational change management. I spent an hour in the cafeteria breaking down what I'd learned from nearly 2 decades of being invisible, watching how decisions really got made, how influence actually moved through systems. They listened. They took notes. They started inviting me to study groups. Isolde came back from Paris for the quarterly board meeting in November. I saw her in the hallway outside the executive suites, talking with two board members, her body language animated and intense. She saw me walking past with my leadership program materials, my arms full of case studies and financial reports, and her expression did something complicated. She excused herself from the board members and walked toward me, her heels loud in the quiet hallway. "This is pathetic," she said, when she was close enough that her voice wouldn't carry. "You're 42 years old, playing student with people half your age. You think this makes you credible? You think anyone takes this seriously?" I looked at her, this woman who'd had every advantage from birth. Every door opened before she reached for the handle, and I felt something that wasn't quite pity, but close. "I think learning is never pathetic. I think growing is never too late. And I think you're scared of what it means if I'm right about that." Her face flushed. "I'm not scared of you. You're nothing. You'll always be nothing, no matter how many programs you take or who you married." I shifted my materials to my other arm. "Then why are you here having this conversation instead of preparing for your board presentation?" She didn't have an answer for that. She just turned and walked away, her composure cracking at the edges. The board meeting that day changed something fundamental. Callum had requested that leadership program participants observe from the gallery, part of our education in corporate governance. I sat in the back row with 7 other participants, our notebooks ready, watching as Isolde presented her European division results. She was polished and prepared, her slides showing aggressive growth, market share gains, revenue increases that made the numbers dance. "The European division has exceeded targets for 6 consecutive quarters," she told the board, her voice confident. "We've entered 3 new markets, acquired 2 smaller competitors, and positioned ourselves for dominance in the region. This is the model for global expansion." The board members nodded, impressed by the trajectory. Then Callum stood. "Before we celebrate these results, I'd like the board to examine what they cost us." He pulled up a different presentation. Data I recognized because I'd helped compile it months earlier, as part of a leadership program assignment on sustainable growth metrics. Employee turnover rates in Isolde's division. Exit interview patterns. Client retention beyond the first contract year. Legal settlements paid quietly to former employees. The numbers told a story that her revenue charts had hidden. "This is growth through extraction," Callum said, his voice measured but firm. "We're burning through talent, pushing people beyond sustainable limits, winning contracts through aggressive tactics that damage long-term relationships. The moment we stop feeding this model with constant new resources, it collapses." Isolde's composure cracked. "Those numbers are out of context. Turnover is normal in competitive markets. You can't build aggressively without some casualties." Callum turned to face her directly. "Casualties. You just called the people who built this company casualties. That's the problem. Leadership isn't about how much you can extract before the well runs dry. It's about building systems that sustain themselves, that make people want to stay, that create value beyond quarterly earnings." The board voted to restructure the European division under shared leadership, adding oversight that would limit Isolde's autonomy. She left the boardroom without speaking to anyone, her heels striking the floor like accusations. I continued through the leadership program, taking rotational assignments that put me in struggling divisions, places where the extraction model had already burned through resources. I spent 3 months in the Southeast Regional Office where morale was devastated after 2 rounds of restructuring. I listened to employees who'd stopped believing their opinions mattered, who showed up because they needed paychecks but had given up on contributing ideas. I didn't have authority to make big changes, but I had time and attention. I started asking questions. What obstacles prevented them from doing their jobs well? What resources would actually help? What decisions from leadership made their work harder instead of easier? Then I documented everything, built a transformation plan that focused on retention, on developing internal talent, on creating pathways for growth that didn't require burning people out. I presented it to my program cohort first, refined it based on their feedback, then submitted it to the program directors. They forwarded it to the board. The board approved it for pilot implementation. 6 months later, the Southeast Division's turnover had dropped by 40%. Employee satisfaction scores had climbed. Two major clients who'd been considering leaving renewed their contracts, specifically citing improved service quality. The board noticed. More importantly, employees noticed. Word spread through the company about the woman from the leadership program who'd actually listened, who'd built something that worked by valuing people instead of consuming them. Meanwhile, Isolde's European division continued its aggressive trajectory, but the cracks were showing. 3 senior executives left to join competitors, taking institutional knowledge with them. 2 major clients switched to rival companies, later hiring those same executives Isolde had pushed out. Her revenue numbers stayed strong, but the foundation was crumbling, visible to anyone who looked beyond quarterly reports. The leadership program concluded in my second year with final presentations to the executive team. Each participant had to propose a strategic initiative for company growth, defend it against questioning, demonstrate understanding of implementation challenges. I presented a model for sustainable expansion into emerging markets, built on partnership rather than dominance, on developing local leadership rather than importing it, on long-term relationship building rather than rapid extraction. The executives asked hard questions. How would this generate returns fast enough for investors? How would we compete against more aggressive rivals? What made me think this model could work in markets where speed mattered more than sustainability? I answered every question, drawing on 2 years of intensive learning and 18 years of watching what actually worked when nobody was performing for quarterly reports. When I finished, the room was quiet. Then the chief operations officer, a woman who'd built her career on turning struggling divisions around, started asking follow-up questions that weren't challenges but genuine curiosity. We talked for 20 minutes after the formal presentation ended, about implementation details, about change management, about how to shift organizational culture toward long-term thinking. Callum said nothing during my presentation. He sat in the back of the room, his expression neutral, living up to his promise not to interfere. But afterward, in the parking structure where nobody could see us, he pulled me close and said, "You earned that. Every word, every answer, you earned it." I was exhausted, running on 2 hours of sleep and more coffee than was probably healthy, but I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not pride, exactly. More like the quiet certainty that I'd done something real, something that mattered, something that existed independently of anyone's permission or approval. 2 months later, Callum announced his retirement timeline. 3 years, he told the board and the company, 3 years to ensure stable transition, to evaluate leadership candidates, to make decisions based on demonstrated capacity rather than assumption or entitlement. The announcement triggered exactly the chaos he'd expected. Isolde flew in from Paris within 24 hours, her fury barely contained. She met with board members individually, building alliances, making promises about returns and growth and aggressive expansion. She met with major investors, painting a picture of the company's past future. Under her leadership, all speed and dominance and market conquest. She was compelling because she believed it, because she'd spent her whole life preparing for this moment, because to her it was destiny being delayed by bureaucratic obstacles. But something had shifted in the company's culture during those 2 years. Employees who'd been through restructurings, who'd watched talented colleagues get burned out and discarded, who'd seen the human cost of extraction-based growth, started speaking up in ways they hadn't before. Anonymous feedback to the board about leadership concerns. Exit interviews that were more honest about why people left. Internal surveys showing what employees actually valued, what made them stay or leave. The data built a narrative that contradicted Isolde's story about what strong leadership looked like. I was offered a position in the executive development track, a newly created role focused on organizational sustainability and talent retention. It came with a significant salary increase, a team of 6 people, and direct reporting to the chief operations officer. I accepted. Isolde heard about it and showed up at my new office on my first day, walking past my assistant without announcement. "This is his doing," she said, not bothering with greetings. "He's creating positions for you, manipulating the system to make you look legitimate." I gestured to the chair across from my workspace. She didn't sit. The position was created based on board recommendation after pilot program results in the Southeast Division. Callum wasn't involved in the decision. She leaned across my workspace, her hands flat on the surface. You've taken everything from me. My father, my inheritance, my future, and you did it by playing victim, by making him feel sorry for you. I looked at her, really looked, and saw something that made me sad. I didn't take anything. You lost it by treating people like they were disposable. You lost it by believing cruelty was strength. You lost it every time you chose short-term victory over long-term sustainability. Her composure finally shattered completely. I've spent my entire life preparing for this. I've sacrificed everything. I've built my whole identity around being worthy of this company. And you just showed up, married my father, and decided you wanted what's mine. There it was, the core of her fury. Not that she was losing something she'd earned, but that she was losing something she'd been promised. Something she'd built her identity around deserving. It was never yours, I said quietly. That's what you still don't understand. The company isn't a crown to inherit. It's a responsibility to earn. And earning it means proving you can value people, not just use them. She left without responding, but something in her expression had changed from fury to something more dangerous. Determination. The next 18 months became a quiet war. Isolde launched a campaign to prove she was the obvious successor, pushing her division harder, finding new markets to enter, new competitors to acquire, new ways to show aggressive growth. She cultivated board relationships, took members to dinners where she painted visions of the company's future, made promises about returns that sounded impressive if you didn't think too hard about sustainability. She was strategic and relentless, using every tool she'd developed over 32 years of learning how to win. But I was building something different. My team developed programs for employee development, for identifying and nurturing internal talent, for creating career pathways that made people want to stay. We piloted mentorship initiatives that connected senior employees with newer ones, transferring institutional knowledge instead of letting it walk out the door. We implemented feedback systems that actually listened to what employees needed, then acted on that information. The results weren't dramatic or immediate. They were gradual, steady, the kind of growth that compounds over time. Turnover decreased across divisions where we implemented programs. Employee satisfaction increased. Client retention improved because relationships were built on stability rather than constant turnover. The company's reputation as an employer strengthened, making recruitment easier. Callum watched both of us, never commenting publicly on who should succeed him, maintaining his promise not to interfere. But I knew he was gathering information, watching how we operated, measuring not just results, but methods. Not just what we achieved, but what we sacrificed to achieve it. The board established evaluation criteria for succession candidates. Financial performance, yes, but also employee retention, client relationship quality, ethical compliance, sustainable growth patterns, leadership development of teams. The criteria suggested someone had been paying attention to what actually mattered for long-term organizational health. 6 months before Callum's planned retirement, Isolde's European division had a crisis. One of her key executives filed a lawsuit alleging systematic discrimination and hostile work environment. The executive had documentation, emails showing pressure to falsify performance reports, records of meetings where Isolde had explicitly told managers to push employees until they quit, rather than firing them to avoid severance costs. Testimony from multiple employees about tactics that lived in ethical gray zones. The company settled quickly and quietly, but the board had seen the documentation. They'd seen proof of what many had suspected, but couldn't confirm. That Isolde's growth model wasn't just aggressive, it was destructive. That her leadership style didn't just push people hard, it broke them deliberately. The board met privately without Callum, using an outside consultant to facilitate discussion about succession options. They reviewed 3 years of performance data across multiple dimensions. They interviewed employees at every level. They examined not just what each candidate had achieved, but how they'd achieved it, what they'd built versus what they'd consumed. Then they made their decision. The announcement came on a Tuesday morning, delivered to all employees simultaneously through the company communication system. The board had selected the next leader. My name appeared in that announcement, not because I was Callum's wife, but despite it. The message outlined the evaluation criteria, the process used, the unanimous board vote. It emphasized that succession had been based on demonstrated capacity to lead with both vision and integrity, to build sustainable growth, to value people as the company's most important resource. I was in my office when the announcement went out, preparing for a team meeting. My assistant appeared in the doorway, her face showing something between shock and joy. "Did you know?" she asked. I shook my head. The board had kept their deliberations completely confidential. My phone started buzzing immediately. Messages from colleagues, from leadership program participants, from employees I'd worked with in various divisions. Most were congratulatory. Some were surprised. A few were angry, believing Isolde deserved the position by virtue of bloodline. Isolde showed up at my office an hour later. Her face was composed but colorless, her movements precise in the way people move when they're holding themselves together through force of will. "This was always your plan," she said from the doorway. "From the moment you met him. Marry the chairman. Position yourself. Take what wasn't yours." I stood up, faced her directly. "I met your father at a charity auction, where I was managing a guest list. I married him because he was kind and I was tired of being alone. I joined the leadership program because I was tired of being invisible. I earned this position through 2 years of work that had nothing to do with who I married." She stepped into the office, and I saw that her hands were shaking. "You've destroyed my life, everything I've worked for, everything I am. You've taken it all." The pain in her voice was real, and I felt something that surprised me. Compassion, maybe, or just recognition of what it costs to build your entire identity around a single future, and then watch it disappear. "I didn't take your life," I told her. "I built my own." The board made their decision based on what they believe is best for the company. If you want to blame someone, blame the person who taught you that people were disposable. Blame the mindset that valued extraction over sustainability. Blame the choices you made every time you prioritized winning over doing right. She was quiet for a long moment, her expression cycling through emotions too quickly to name. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "He chose you over me, my own father, not just for the company, for everything. He looks at you the way he used to look at my mother. He values your opinion more than mine. I didn't just lose the company. I lost him." That truth sat between us, heavy and undeniable. "You didn't lose him," I said. "You lost his respect, and you lost it by becoming someone he couldn't believe in. That's not my fault. That's yours." She left then, walking out of my office and out of the building. She submitted her resignation that afternoon, effective immediately. She didn't attend the transition meetings or participate in knowledge transfer. She just disappeared from the company she'd spent her whole life preparing to lead, leaving behind a European division that had to be rebuilt from the foundation up because her leadership had created impressive numbers, but no sustainable systems. Callum and I talked that evening in our apartment, the city lights spreading below us like possibilities. "She's my daughter," he said quietly. "I love her. But I couldn't give her something she would have destroyed." I leaned against him, feeling the weight of what we'd both lost and gained. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" He was quiet for a long time. "I think she'll understand that she lost. Whether she understands why is up to her." The transition took 3 months. Callum formally retired, staying on the board in an advisory capacity, but stepping away from daily operations. I moved into the executive suite with its floor-to-ceiling windows and its weight of responsibility for 11,000 employees across 14 countries. The first board meeting I led was terrifying and exhilarating. Standing at the head of that room, where I'd once sat in the gallery, taking notes, presenting vision and strategy, and being questioned by people who'd forgotten I'd ever been forgettable. But I knew this company. I knew it from the ground up. From 18 years of invisible work and 2 years of intensive learning, I knew what made it work and what broke it. I knew the difference between numbers that looked good and systems that functioned sustainably. The company evolved under my leadership, not dramatically, not with aggressive expansion or market dominance, but steadily, building on foundations that could support long-term growth. Employee retention improved across divisions. Client relationships deepened because they were built on consistency rather than constant turnover. Innovation increased because people felt safe contributing ideas. Profitability grew Not through extraction, but through efficiency, through keeping talented people who made good decisions, through building reputation that attracted better clients. 5 years later, the company was stronger than it had been under Isolde's aggressive model. Not flashier, not more dramatic, just more sustainable, more resilient, more human. I saw Isolde once more, at an industry conference 3 years after she'd left. She'd started a consulting firm specializing in aggressive market expansion, and she was apparently successful. Her client list impressive. We ended up in the same elevator, heading to different sessions. She looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us spoke. But something had changed in her expression. Not forgiveness. Exactly. Maybe just acceptance that the world had moved forward without her, that her birthright had never been guaranteed, that losing had made her into something different than she'd planned to become. The elevator doors opened. She walked out first, disappearing into the crowd, and I realized I didn't feel triumph or vindication. Just a quiet sadness for all the energy we both spent on a war that didn't have to happen if she'd understood earlier that value isn't inherited, it's demonstrated. Thank you for listening to this whole journey. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about what real strength looks like, about what leadership costs and what it builds, then leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Hit that subscribe button if you want more. Stories about people who didn't win through luck or birthright, but through showing up and doing the work nobody noticed until it mattered. And remember that expiration dates only exist for people who think human value has a shelf life. The rest of us just keep growing, keep learning, keep proving that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage of all.